Thank you, everyone. We are resuming with a new session on women in academia. And our main speaker is Professor Dawn Teele, which is assistant professor at Johns Hopkins University, another alma mater of mine. And she is gonna talk about, why is we doing this? She is gonna talk about gender in journals. She's an expert in the field. And then Malina Voicu and myself will complement more from an anecdotal point of view to what you say. Dawn, you're up.
Okay, I'm looking. I have a couple of slides, but I don't know if I'll be able to. I guess I'm probably not a host, so it won't work. It's a little bit hard for me to see because other participants. Can you tell me how long you would like to speak?
Oh, 15 minutes, 20 minutes? Okay. Can you hear me?
Just barely.
Go. Okay, I think we're good. You can go.
Okay, how long would you like me to speak?
20 minutes, something like that, 15 minutes, whatever. Yeah.
Okay, great. So hi, everybody. It's so nice to be here today, and I'm really sorry that I couldn't actually be in person. As I said, I was supposed to be in New York City for a conference tomorrow, and then everybody in my household came down with COVID. We managed to avoid it thus far. So I guess I feel lucky that it's just at this stage of the pandemic that this has afflicted us. So my research is on gender and politics, and I'm a political scientist, and most of my work is on the long-term historical and economic transformations that have made it more or less possible for women to participate fully in public life. So my first book was about, actually my first edited volume was about methodology in political science and economics, and in particular, the use of field experiments in social scientific research and kind of the surge of that beginning in the early 2000s. And then my monograph is about how women earned the franchise and the relationship between electoral competition and women's enfranchisement. And then I have another book that was recently published with Temple University Press that talks about the barriers and things that smooth over women's candidacies for office. So looking at women in the legislative arena in the United States and beyond. But a big part of my interest has always been trying to understand the landscape for women who are in academia and some of the challenges that women face as they kind of ascend through the academic hierarchies. And I think we can think of these problems as starting from infancy. There's a lot of research in political science that talks about socialization and the types of things that happen in the household that make women, more or less interested in high-flying careers. And then in some of the social sciences, we can think also about the kind of increasing mathematification, for lack of a better word, or the quantification of the discipline, and how a lot of times with socialization, girls and boys and women and men, and likely also non-binary students are treated in different ways vis-a-vis mathematics. So there's a lot of research that shows that the closer an academic discipline is to people believing that it requires genius in order to do it well, the less likely there are to be women in those positions. But women have made really massive strides, and it's almost odd given both the fact that women outnumber men as undergraduates and have for more, almost 2 decades now. Claudia Golden's work is pretty good on the educational transition beginning in 1980s. And also the fact that, women are very successful in many of the academic fields. So my own research has tried to think about the way that networks either promote or stymie women's investment and advantage in particular types of methodological techniques. And so in my own field of political science, which has deep commitments to interpretive research, to qualitative research, and to political theory, at the same time that I think the dominant methodology, well, it's probably mixed methods, but more and more so quantitative methods have kind of taken over, taken over the discipline. In my own discipline, I was trying to figure out why the top journals had so many more men on its bylines than women, and to think more about the nature of the networks that promote those types of collaborations. And so I did some research with Kathy Teele, who was the former president of APSA and is a historical institutionalist, political scientist, but also Kathy Thielen's work is pretty well known in sociology and in history. She and I, when she was president of the American Political Science Association, wanted to think a little bit more about gendered patterns of publication in the discipline's top journals. And so we undertook an investigation that went back 30 or 40 years, tracking both the nature of authorship, so how patterns of authorship have changed over time, the gendered patterns of authorship within those other sort of long-term trends, and also thinking about how those two things are related to the byline problem. And what we discovered is that although a man working alone is still the most common byline in political science, there has been a real takeoff in terms of collaboration in our field towards all male teams or co-ed teams. So women working alone or women working together didn't appear at as high of rates as these other types of collaboration in our discipline's top journals. And what we did to try to think about why that was the case is code up all of the articles based on the type of methodology that they used, and also thinking a little bit about the subfield that they're coming from. So political theory, which is both, kind of normative and historical political theory, as well as kind of interpretive political theory, has, way less collaboration than some of the more quantitative fields like American politics or some areas of comparative politics, which is my field. And so what we did was we kind of coded for methodology and for substance across all of these articles in 10 of the discipline's top journals. And we found, correlation is not causation, but every once in a while you get a graph that is that's so obvious that something else has to be up, right? The relationship is so stark. And so basically, to the degree to which journals were publishing quantitative research, they were publishing way fewer women among their bylines, and they were also publishing way more collaborative work. So essentially, what we discovered was that the problem of women's underrepresentation in the discipline's top journals was related to the quantification of political science. Now, we could say that's a good reason to not have the field be as quanti or technical as it is. Maybe it's on the wrong path, and those critiques are things that I'm totally willing to engage with and happy to think more about. I do a lot, but my kind of intuition is that if we're going to be bean counters to any degree in the discipline, we've got to show women the beans, right? We have to give women the skills that they need in order to be able to participate in the mainstream trends in the discipline. And I think that has to do with quantitative education. And it's somewhat obvious that there are very few women who are teaching the main quantitative method sequences in many of the top 20 PhD granting institutions in political science. That's changing a little bit, but really slowly. So there's a kind of mentorship aspect to it, a role model aspect to it. Also, like, if women aren't in those positions, maybe people won't consider a woman for those positions. Those are kind of, those are things that departments can do, right? Think about who is going to be teaching their main method sequence. But then there's something kind of simpler, which has to do with research networks and what people as advisors or very senior people who command a lot of resources and who are in a position where they are bringing graduate students in as collaborators, things that these people can do, who are, research machines, who have all the experience in the world, can do to increase the gender and, of course, racial, and other forms of diversity in their own teams. So political science is moving more towards what we think of as a lab model, which I'm kind of hesitant about because my research is mostly very slow and it's mostly just me, and I don't really want to have 5,000 projects going on at a time. I want to read my history and think about things over a long period of time. But it is moving in a lab model for many people, and so that I think has implications for, or at least there are implications for how, if we care about gender equality in the discipline of political science, we should be pushing people who are commanding those kinds of resources to include women, and kind of potentially even more importantly, to make sure that the people who are heading the institutions that are bringing in lots of independent graduate students and the people who are getting the grants to set up their own labs are also representative of the methodological breadth of the field, but also the kind of diversity of the field of political science in general. So poli-sci is kind of in the middle of the road in terms of gender diversity among undergraduates, and sociology and anthropology both have more women undergraduates and tend to have slightly more women on their faculties than political science. And economics is as many people in the room would know, the worst of the bunch. And so, it's not the case that there just simply aren't women that are in the pipeline to kind of take on all of these roles. It is the case that the training, I think, has tended to be gender biased over time. And some people would say, well, that's because women are just going to be interested in different things. And I think there's an element that may be true to that. We do know in political science that there are certain themes, even within subfield, like within the subfield of international relations, things that are related to humanitarianism and peace studies have many more women in them than things that are related to, kind of guns and bombs and great power politics. There are exceptions, of course. So there is sorting within subfield in terms of the substantive interest of different scholars. But in fact, the methodologies across these different subject matters tend to actually be rather similar. And so that would suggest that there's no real reason why women, shouldn't be part of the collaborations that are using some of these top methods. And I think, I've looked at this in a couple of other instances, and I'd be happy, to follow up with anybody later if you want to see some of my published work on the subject. But I also looked at book manuscripts. So what a lot of people said when we published this article on gender in the journals was, well, you might see this bias in journal articles, right? But maybe that's because women are more likely to be in book fields. And so maybe if you look at the books, you won't see quite the same imbalances that you see in the journals. And books tend to be more multi-methods, and are a large part of the tenure case for many scholars in many subfields in political science. Still, the book is the major aspect of the tenure case. And so I looked at books, and my colleague David Samuels, who is the editor of Comparative Political Studies, which is one of the major journals in comparative politics, he and I looked at citations in books, and we basically found that for the most part, women's books tend to be slightly less cited than men's books, given their rank in the institution. And so we think, the problems aren't even just related to journals, but they're also sort of more apparent, or they're still apparent in the book business. And so I think that's somewhat disheartening. But one of the interesting findings was that it was actually, there was closer parity in citations and recognition in books that were written by associate and assistant professors who were men versus women than at the full professor rank. And so, our intuition from that is that maybe there has been some learning insofar as there's been a lot of conversation in political science about gender diversity and racial diversity recently as well. And so maybe we've made some progress at, at the assistant professor level, you don't see these gaps. And so maybe that will speak to the pipeline moving forward in the next decade or so. But that still leaves this huge problem for women at the full professor rank whose work is sort of under-recognized and under-cited vis-a-vis the men at their same level. And I think that also speaks to this issue I was talking about with funding of research and the fact that labs are more likely to be run by men. And so this sort of lab model, to the degree that we can make sure that that is more diverse than it has been hitherto, I think that that's going to go a long way towards solving some of these kind of network issues that are related to women's position. So I'm happy to talk more, but I don't want to, prattle on for too long, and I'm eager to hear what the other participants say. So I think I will leave it there and look forward to, interacting a little bit more with whoever is in the room and also whoever is on the Zoom.
I have an immediate question before
Sure.
we can. Have you looked at data for COVID? Because my non-empirical and very non-empirical experience is that women, we all had very hard time. And even if we were at home, and even if we are used at working from home, our productivity plunged. Why I had male colleagues was like, oh, wow, that was great. I published like never. So I wonder if you have some hard evidence there.
Yeah, so a lot of stuff is coming out right now. And because my COVID was not 18 months, but more or less like 15 months of very little childcare. I have an 8 and a 6-year-old who were, I guess, 5 and 4.5 and 7 when everything started. So like, this was something that I thought I need to work on this. And then I didn't do basically anything. I wrote one paper the whole time, and it finally was accepted a couple of weeks ago. But there is work that's going to be coming out on this. And what all the journal editors were saying originally is that there was a massive plunge in the number of submissions by women in the first 6 months of the pandemic. And then what I saw about the second 6 months, so a lot of people figured out some kind of childcare arrangement by the fall of last year. So by the second 6 months, there was a little bit of catch up. I mean, women did not overshoot men in terms of submissions, but the rate equalized. The other thing that a couple of my colleagues who are journal editors have reported is that there was a massive increase in journal submissions by men who were graduate students and by men who were from outside the United States in the first 6 months of COVID to these top American journals. And so, regional diversity and, or sort of like the lack of regional diversity in some of these big American publishing conglomerates is definitely a concern. So the fact that this may have been an opportunity for some people who were outside of the United States, who may not have been on the radar of the editors at the very beginning, to get some research into these, kind of generalist outlets, I think, that can be good in some ways, but the fact of the gender inequality in submissions was what was so concerning. And, for anybody who's in the room who's interested in looking at this, I mean, I think, there's this other issue, which is that a lot of people and a lot of women have started having kids younger, like in grad school, vis-a-vis many of our mentors. So, I'm about 40. And I had kids in grad school in part because I had these really wonderful senior women who were full professors at the time who said, they did the traditional thing where they waited until they got tenure, and then, they had a 2-year-old when they were 40, and maybe they could have done it earlier. And so they were really supportive of me, doing that earlier. And so many, basically every female friend that I had in grad school that had kids, or that I had in grad school that was going to have kids, had children then. And I think that was, an interesting transition that we saw in the last 10 years. But if you think about the kind of shock of COVID, if you are both extremely economically vulnerable, because grad students make so little money, and you have this, this child, and it's a child that's basically likely to be too young to want to expose to a variety of different things if you don't have to, then like you're going to see this really massive difference in publication and in job placement for women who had just had children right before COVID broke out, vis-a-vis even 5 years before. But I think one last thing on the childcare, and then I promise I'll shut up, is that, you know, there's also a difference in terms of how old your children were. So if you were a grad student who can't afford, you know, full-time university daycare or something like that, like you're in a really bad position. But kids who were in the one or, you know, almost one to kindergarten age, a lot of those preschools and daycares opened back up relatively quickly because they understand what they are doing as childcare. And then the schools thing obviously got so politicized in the US, so it was actually the slightly older kids who were out of school. So I think that's another kind of comparison that we could make. Not that it was in any way easy for any person who had young children or any care work at home, or hey, even a partner in the house all day while you're trying to work, right? In your pajamas or whatever. So I think, but you know, there's a couple of different comparisons that we can make, and there's definitely work that's going to be coming out on this soon. I've lost the hearing.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay, so you can hear me?
Yeah.
I can hear you now. Yes. Hi.
Hi, I'm Malina Voicu. I'm from Romania. I'm sociologist, working on gender studies as well.
Okay. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, it's fine now. It was very interesting, and I'm really fascinated about all this research on publication, and I think that's a field that should definitely be explored further. While I was listening to you, I thought that, well, being from Europe, I have a more cross-cultural overview. It's not that the academic system in Europe is working differently, but we are very diverse within Europe, and then we can compare to each other, and it's easier to compare us with United States, so to see everything from a comparative perspective. So listening to you, I totally agree, and I think it's very important that usually women are somehow pushed by society to learn humanistic subjects. So usually maths, it's not for women, it's for men. And then later on, this leads to publication in more prestigious journals by men more than by women, because they are better able to handle mathematics and statistics. And that leads me to the fact that some educational systems are more into general studies to everyone. So the curricula is rather general, and that's my hypothesis that probably we need to test it. But in those educational systems where educational curricula in secondary education is more general or includes more mathematics, probably women are doing better in publishing in high-ranked journals. And I have here an idea that, well, why it came this to my mind, because being from former communist Europe, we were taught a lot of mathematics in school. Yeah. No matter whether you were a boy or a girl, so that was what you should supposed to learn. Therefore, at least my generation knows a lot of mathematics, no matter gender. And then when I became a graduate student and I went abroad and presented in conferences, I realized that I was probably amongst the only woman in the room presenting on quantitative methodology. And then I realized slowly that women from former communist countries are better in handling all these quantitative methods. So the point is that educational system during secondary education, I think, matters. Another thing that matters for academia, and also you pointed out, it's the story with childcare. So, and it's very different across Europe as well. So there is no, probably only Scandinavian countries are the, you know, the better case studies in this. Um, but other countries, and now I'm thinking to Germany, by instance, they lack a good childcare system. And the outcome is that if many women from Germany either decide to have a career and they remain childless, um, or they don't get married even, so they don't have their own life, or they decide to have a family and that's it. So there is this polarization in some of the European countries like Germany, Austria, Switzerland, where there is no possibility to do both. So it also depends on not only on the educational system, but also depends on social policy and what societies provide. So I think that's it for now from my side. I will pass the floor to
Okay. And right, and I will try to show you something. So one of the, I lived in DC, Washington DC for 12 years, and DC is, or I should rather say was, all about, you know, colloquium, seminars, conferences. You appear, you exist. You don't appear, you don't exist, right? So with a young assistant, we did a little bit of analysis, and let me see if I can share this. I apologize, I lost the original file, so I will have it to show you from the article. So we looked at at foreign policy, right? Now, 7% of full chairs in IR are women. So it's a very, very small minority. And our question was, if you don't appear, then you're not invited to write. If you don't invite to write, you don't continue. So we looked at panels in foreign policy. Now this is pre-COVID. So it was published in early 2019, and the data refer to before COVID. So one of the things I should do if I had time would be to look at the data afterwards. So has the online changed? Because the online clearly also fixed the problem of kids and everything, or not. Now, what you see here is there's the most prominent think tanks which deal with foreign policy in DC, and we only took into consideration foreign policies. Some of them are specialized, like Nuclear Threat Initiative are specialized in foreign policy. So all their panels, we took in consideration all their panels. Others are like New America, they have a wide range of issues, and we only consider foreign policy. So these were all the panels they held, all the public panels, I should say, because there are a number of non-public panels, and sometimes the data is there, sometimes it's not. So this is elaboration of public data, but you can see that basically only 3 institutions had near parity. The Stimson Center had more women than men. Nuclear Threat Initiative, which is interesting because it's nuclear issue, so it's supposed to be a male thing, but it turns out to be very feminine. It's 50%, and the United States Institute for Peace, almost 50%. And as you are going down to the Center of Strategic and Budgetary Affairs that have a very small minority. Now we also cross-analyzed it. So here you see the numbers. So the major one is RAND, 52%, which actually did, also responding to the previous question, they actually did an effort. They have an actual written policy that they have to have women on panels, and it pays off, 50%. CFR, not bad, Center for American Peace, USZIP, and going down. Now, the interesting thing, let me see if we have it here. No, I didn't put it here, but I can tell you, the interesting thing is that those think tanks which had women at the helm, so for instance, it was the case of GMF, it was the case of New American Foundation, it was the case of the Wilson Center, and I'm forgetting another one. Those who had women at the helm did not fare any better. Actually, they are, as you see, Wilson Center, 30%, and GMF, 20%, 27%, right? Now, the other data that emerged, I'm not remember if it's here or not, is the political affiliation. Oh, here you have. See, among the top scoring, you only had, you only had the Central American Prosecutors and CNS, which had good scoring with women. Now, the other thing that came out was the political affiliation. There is a sharp divide between conservative-leaning think tanks with featuring a very small minority of women, and progressive think tanks. I mean, it couldn't be sharper, the difference. And then the last but not least, in which role are they women speaking? Because if you look at numbers only, you have one data, right? But if you at the percent, in some cases it looks good, 50, as we're saying, 50%, 40%. But then if you look at the roles, women are usually given the master of ceremony roles. So they are the moderators, the one who introduced the panels. But then in terms of actual expert, see, this is, in terms of actual expert, this is it, you see? And this is male only and women only panel. The overwhelming majority of men only, only a few ones had equal. So it's not only a question of numbers, but it's also a question of quality, and I think this is very much the issue today. When we're talking, for instance, we were talking before about the DEI coordinator, diversity, equity, and inclusiveness coordinators. The fact that you put the numbers there, it doesn't mean that you're actually substantially changing. Because if you give a woman the role of, if the women are all the master of ceremonies, their expertise is not valued enough. So anyway, these are little bit numbers. As I said, we should run, I need to reach out to Mimosa, who did this with me, and see if we can redo it on COVID. It would be interesting to see, because now you don't have a mobility factor anymore. So maybe that should have an influence. So if I manage to do that, I'll come back to you, and actually I should totally do this under this, but we'll see. Okay.